tier level of the U.S. government. I mean, it's probably not realistic for the president to be worrying about this issue anytime in the foreseeable future. But I do think you will see an emphasis on trying to identify areas where the United States and China can cooperate together to the benefit of African countries. This may take the form of some collaboration on some joint aid projects, particularly in the fields of health and agriculture. It's already happening in the area of peacekeeping, where basically China's taken the lead, at least in terms of providing personnel. The United States still pays most of the biggest chunk of the cost for these operations. The United States is very pleased that China is putting peacekeeping personnel into Africa, because that means it doesn't have to put personnel into Africa. That collaboration will continue. There are some areas that are potentially conflictual, and the most obvious ones are in the human rights democratization area, where the Obama administration, I think, will take a somewhat more activist approach towards Africa than the Bush administration did, and that may put it from time to time in conflict with China's desire just to stay out of these kinds of problems, to basically ignore them. That puts the United States on the side of civil society in these countries and puts them in opposition to certain African governments. The country where this most frequently comes up is Sudan. That's been a problem during the Bush administration to some extent, although there has been some collaboration between China and the United States on the Darfur problem. China hasn't gone as far as the United States would have liked, but they've done some things vis-a-vis Bashir that have been helpful. The other country that's a problem in this regard is Zimbabwe, where the U.S. position and the Chinese position are quite different. And there probably will be a few other countries that are coming along where there are going to be some significant differences of opinion. But I really think those cases will be the minority, and the majority cases will be efforts to collaborate. And I really think that's what you can look forward to seeing in the years ahead. And another thing that is weighing on this, of course, is what we saw in Beijing with Hillary Clinton and not the elimination of a discussion on human rights. She said very categorically that she raised human rights issues privately with the Chinese. Now, we don't know how she phrased it or anything else, but it's pretty apparent that the fact that China is now the largest holder of U.S. treasuries, and this mess that we have in this country today is so overwhelming that I just can't imagine we're going to go beating up on China on marginal African issues when we've got this treasury issue problem, our own financial future at stake. It's going to be a tendency to go sort of once over lightly, I think, on some of the human rights issues.
Yes, correct me if I'm wrong, Ambassador. Europe, they have issued a blueprint way of cooperating with China in Africa, a tripartite approach.
Right.
How come then, from what you said about the U.S. and the Bush administration and the Obama administration, willing also to cooperate with China, how come Europe and the U.S. here are not working together in order to impose that multilateral approach to Africa?
Why the U.S. and Europe are not working together?
Yes, closer. Because it's
Yeah.
that Europe's blueprint is really a European approach to Africa.
Yeah, that's a very fair question, and I'm not sure I have a real good answer for you. There certainly is discussion going on between Europe and the United States and China. In fact, I've taken part in sort of the track 2 end of that discussion, not on behalf of the U.S. government. But you make a good point. As far as I know, there hasn't been much done at the government-to-government level between Europe and the United States vis-a-vis China, unless it's been part of these bilateral discussions that just for whatever reason doesn't get reported in the press, and I suppose that's possible, that it's so marginal in the grand scheme of things that it just doesn't get picked up on. But whatever's going on, it's not much. And that is an interesting point to make, and I think you're probably right in coming to that conclusion.
I have a question for both speakers. Thank you very much for really interesting presentations. First, for David Shinn, you just talked about this a little bit with your commentary on Hillary Clinton's recent visit, but I was struck in your list at the beginnings of the things that China and the U.S. shared in common vis-a-vis Africa by what they didn't share in common. Specifically, in the case of China's attitude to the countries that recognize Taiwan and the symbolic capital that carries for China, and the U.S. interest in counterterrorism efforts. So I'm wondering if you could talk in more qualitative terms about those differences and how they might affect the future of U.S. and China relations through Africa, shall we say. And then with Jamie Monson, I really enjoyed your talk, and I was just so struck by your comment that the Chinese or your surprise, first of all, with how the Chinese reacted to BBTD and some of the other African delegations, and also by Chinese surprise at some things such as open conflict and singing. Because if you look back in Chinese history, it's not at all surprising to me that they took women, these African delegations, to textile factories, or that they saw that as a site of not only ideological indoctrination, but as practical work, so the whole category of women's work. And if you are interested, there's quite a large literature on Republican-era China and CCP organizing of women through factories and also through women's own organizations. The reason I'm surprised by the Chinese surprise is also if you look in the post-49 period, the CCP made prominent use of local cultural genres, folk genres, for instance, as templates for conveying ideological socialist messages. So they took folk songs and kept their structure, their basic structure, mnemonic structure, and infused them with new content. This would have happened not only in urban workplaces, but also in the countryside. So there's a little bit of historical forgetting going on there. And the 60s is not too late for that still to be going on. In fact, it would continue throughout the 60s up until the Cultural Revolution in many places. So there's a whole interesting, larger picture that these are perhaps fitting into that would be fascinating to trace out more.
Why don't you go ahead and go first?
Yeah, that's really helpful. That's something that as I'm working in these archives, clearly this is something that I want to look into more. And it's interesting to see who the models are that are kind of held up for revolutionary womanhood, at least in this particular case, and I don't have enough of a background on the China side to understand it. But for example, Bibi Titi was often accompanied by the wife of Zhou Enlai, and she was polite and very gracious, and it seems that many of these prominent women were not themselves leaders, but the wives of leaders. And here Bibi Titi was the leader, and her husband was kind of this weird loose cannon. But this is something that's really interesting. And there was one woman, Asha Ali, who was the wife of the ZPP Zanzibari political leader, who was the model African woman. Interestingly, she had, if I'm remembering correctly, I'm not quite sure what her background was, but at any rate, she was a model woman. But what made her model was her willingness to learn. This pedagogical part was so important. She always was attentive. She took notes. She would always say, I learned so much. She asked interesting questions. And so this also was a contradiction then, that sometimes those women that had that kind of response were women who were literate, who'd been to school, who knew how to learn in a certain kind of way. And so here they were bringing over these district level women, or women like Bibi Titi, who was very much from a grassroots urban women's movement. And then when they behaved like women of grassroots urban Muslim singing clubs, you know, they weren't the model woman that, for example, Asha Ali was. So, but I definitely have a great deal of work to do to understand that whole Chinese context. Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that. Just one more thing to say is, in my work on Tazara, I'm working with lots of poetry that has this quality of bringing some, in this case, kind of classical poetic frameworks, but then inserting all of this revolutionary language. It's fascinating poetry about modernization and technology, and I haven't found that for women yet, but it's because I haven't been looking. So I'm sure there's quite a lot there that I haven't seen.
You quite properly point out that there are at least a couple of very important differences in U.S. and Chinese interests in Africa. I happen to be more surprised, I guess, or more struck by the similarities, because I think I would have assumed before I ever started researching this topic that there would be far more differences than there would be similarities. And to find that the similarities are so striking as to me, the surprise. But you note both in the case of Taiwan and China's, Beijing's interest in having the diplomatic component of Taiwan's presence removed. And I choose my language very carefully. I didn't say the commercial or the economic component. They don't care if Taiwan is involved commercially or economically in Africa, unless, of course, they're involved with their office in the capital city of an African country. That's a no-no, as they are in the case of Abuja. And I can't tell you how much effort the Chinese government is expending trying to physically remove the Taiwan trade mission from Abuja to Lagos or anywhere. I don't care where it is, as long as it's not Abuja. Because if it's in the capital, it implies a diplomatic relationship. The other extreme is we spent time in Swaziland, and Swaziland is one of those 4 countries that recognizes Taiwan. And we visited one of the big textile factories owned by a Taiwan national that employs a lot of Chinese and Swazis in the factory. And where do you suppose most of the Chinese come from who work in the Taiwan factory? They come from mainland China. They don't come from Taiwan at all. So there are all kinds of interesting connections at the commercial economic side. But when you get to protocol issues and diplomatic issues, it is very strict and it is very serious business. And the United States, of course, is sort of, they're off the side on this. They don't want to get involved in this discussion, quite frankly. It's just not part of U.S. interest. The other one is counterterrorism. This is an interesting one because it's going through a little bit of a change as we sit here. The fact that the Chinese have sent the 2 destroyers and a supply ship to the Gulf of Suez, which is working with, not part of, but with an international task force in the Gulf of Suez, including one led by an American admiral, is very intriguing. One, the Chinese have a very distinct interest in this because there are a lot of either Chinese ships or ships carrying Chinese goods that are going through that area, and they have been subject to attacks by Somali pirates, so they really do want to do something about it. But it may be the first indication of sort of a serious Chinese security interest in Africa other than these 2 port visits that I mentioned earlier, one in 2000 and one in 2002. Maybe I'm reaching here. Maybe that's not where it's heading. And even this is not directly related to counterterrorism because the piracy issue has nothing to do with terrorism. But on the other hand, the Chinese are finding that increasingly as they engage in risky areas in Africa, like the Gulf of Guinea or the Niger Delta, like the Ogaden in Ethiopia, where I think 8 or 9 of them were killed, in southern Kordofan, which borders Darfur, in northern Niger, where a Chinese uranium prospector was arrested or was kidnapped and let go. They're finding that more and more Chinese personnel are experiencing the same problems that Western personnel are facing. And even though most of these activities are not related to terrorism, they're related to things that get awfully close to terrorism, and they're getting concerned about it, and they're starting to rethink how to deal with all of this. Now, I don't think that's going to drive them into the hands of American counterterrorism policy, don't get me wrong. And for that matter, I don't think Obama's counterterrorism policy is going to be Bush's counterterrorism policy. So I think you're going to see a number of interesting developments taking place in the next year or two with changes on both the American and the Chinese side for dealing with these sort of nasty incidents in Africa that either are attacks on the nationals of our 2 respective countries, or conceivably even related directly to terrorism. The other area that I mentioned is the whole military security relationship. Both countries have a very strong link on the military security side, except on the Chinese side, it's high-level visits and it's training and it's a lot of fluff and fanfare, and it's also selling of military equipment, which is very important, up to and including now jet aircraft. China is becoming a major supplier of sort of trainer-level aircraft to African countries. But it's not a desire to have a military base on the continent. In fact, China continues to say, make a big deal of the fact that it has no military bases in Africa and it wants none. And I'm willing to take them at face value for that, at least for the time being. Whereas the American position is very, very different on this, and the Chinese find themselves sitting in a more desirable spot on this particular issue than the United States is, because of this overwhelming emphasis by the United States on counterterrorism in Africa that has created some difficulties for the United States. There are other areas that I didn't go into that where there are differences beyond human rights and democratization, things like work safety regulations, agreeing to contracts, corruption issues, oh goodness, the EITI concerns about corporate and social responsibility, a whole series of issues out there where there are disagreements between the U.S. and China.
This is a question for Jamie, and you may not know the answer, but maybe you have more information than I do on the subject anyway. Can you bring us up to date in any way, shape, or form on some of these delegations of African women? I know there was a conference a couple of years ago. Nigerian women and business women from West Africa and other places went to China and to meet presumably with Chinese business women. And I remember coming across that on the internet, and actually I have it somewhere printed out. But have you heard, since you're there, I'm just wondering if you've heard of anything. That's part A, and part B. About that one, but are there any other that you can think of in terms of African women? And I'm thinking of the people like Gertrude Mandela from from Tanzania, who was so involved in the Beijing conference, and I'm thinking of China's relationships with maybe Liberia at the present time. I have some nice little articles on Her Majesty Ellen talking about the new rice demonstration farms in Liberia from the Chinese, and of course the Vice President of Uganda and the Vice President of South Africa, who are women. How are they treated? Do they make high-level visits? Just to kind of pull out women in their own right who are political leaders and not quote-unquote model women or wives, and the whole cults of the first ladies in Africa, perhaps what happens to them in China. That's a different story.
Yeah. I wish I could answer your question, but I haven't really looked at these contemporary ones, but they're definitely there. And I think that there continue to be all kinds of delegations all the time. And I think this gets back to Wenron's point and your point too, is sort of what's the future, what's the follow-up. And I think what these records show is there are lots of ways that there are continuities, this Chinese emphasis on the person-to-person visits. So again, not just that Hu Jintao goes and the presidents go so often, but there are all kinds of cultural exchanges and exchanges of women, exchanges of youth that continue to go on. But I don't study this. I couldn't give you any specifics, but it wouldn't be hard to find out. And I think the whole Beijing thing is fascinating too. I mean, somebody could spend it, because Beijing used to be the metaphor in Tanzania for years for women's liberation. They'd be go, oh, I can't stand my wife anymore. She's just like so Beijing, and it was just, that was it, and it became a verb. Like, right. You could be Beijinged, and you could, women were Beijinging, which meant they were becoming aware of
Tanzania was so important in the Beijing conference.
Yeah, but I think generally when I was trying to find literature on this topic, and I'm just in the archives, so I really, these other secondary sources I haven't even begun to look at, but that's what came up more often as I looked up Beijing and women. It was just, so much of that connection. But I'm sorry, maybe others have looked at this more. Maybe you have, I don't know. But my guess is there's a lot there. And I think that, again, that's what I was trying to say of sort of the point of all of this. I think there's just a lot more continuity that we don't see, that's under the radar because people aren't looking. People don't talk a lot about these gendered aspects people don't talk a lot about these personal visits. And I think what you mentioned is so helpful that, I often think that the more we learn, the more we'll see continuities between the 60s and 70s and the present. I think then the real difference, perhaps, is that this possibility of cooperation between the United States and China, that the intense rivalry, like thinking about the Peace Corps, these 60s documents. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in 1978. I couldn't go to Tanzania. They didn't have Peace Corps because there was such a backlash. And the kind of intense anti-Peace Corps language in the archives is unbelievable. What Peace Corps volunteers were being accused of during the time that I was one, I was, whoa, But now, interestingly, China has a hard time mobilizing their young people to go into Peace Corps now that they're embracing it. So I think there are lots of interesting continuities and differences that it'll become more complex. So it won't be that was then and this is now, but that we can see China in Africa with a deeper perspective.
Yes, this is a wonderful panel, and I must say that I'm very, very topic. There is one way of kind of also looking at especially the women's movements, and I'm thinking about the December 31st women's movement. Those of you who work on Ghana, and how people, at least from what we know from the newspapers, how some of these people used the organizations to, for their own profit, so to speak, or for their own interest, and how, after their governments were in power, after they were out of power, or when they were out of power, they were brought before the courts, for having profited from, things which should have gone to the general public. So it would be kind of interesting to see how in modern day Africa, how some of these have used their organizations, for their own profit instead of for the benefit of the general population. Now, to Ambassador Shinn, what I'm thinking also is, to kind of look at it from the point of view of Africans. How do these Africans view, the Chinese cooperation? Excuse me. How do they view the trade and cooperation with the U.S.? What is being said in the newspapers, about said corporations? Because I remember, depending on the kind of era and the people who are in government, there are some of these words and terminologies which kind of come up, which kind of more or less describe the way that people perceive either it's trade or military or whatever cooperation that's going on. So I guess my question is, what do we get, or how can we, I'm still trying to throw the question in my head. Looking at what is in the newspapers and looking at what we hear from people, how do these Africans look at these corporations? And do you look at them the same way? Are there differences? Is there preference for one, against the other?
Go ahead. Okay. There's actually a fair amount of information out there as to how Africans view the Chinese presence, which mainly refers to their economic commercial presence, but also more widely other things that they're doing on the continent. And in fact, there may be more information on that in the last couple of years than there is on how they view the United States or the West, because the United States is kind of taken for granted at this point. And it's interesting, and what I'm saying now is really based more on having traveled for 2 months through Africa in the summer of 2007, researching the China-Africa relationship. And we tried to meet with a real wide variety of people. I was able to have pretty good access at senior levels of government on the one hand, but then we would meet with labor union leaders and academicians and opposition political party people and civil society representatives, and I was traveling with a young sinologist colleague who has fluent Mandarin, so he was able to chat up all the Chinese laborers when we ran across them, and had it sort of a built-in entree into the Chinese community whenever we alighted somewhere. So it was really a very good, I think, overview of where people are coming from. Now, if I had to distill that down into a few sentences as to where the Africans are coming from, and we visited 7 countries in Africa, I would say that at the governmental level, almost without exception, there was great enthusiasm for what China is doing. Occasionally a little expression of concern. Well, yeah, our trade deficit's a little high with China, or they've got a few too many laborers here. They could have a few more African laborers than Chinese laborers. Every now and again you'd get a little bit of that kind of feedback, but not serious at all. Certainly not any condemnation of what China is doing in Africa. If I were to summarize the civil society group and the labor unions and opposition political parties, I'd almost have to make a few nuanced distinctions, but by and large it was a good deal of skepticism at best and some outright hostility at worst. For example, the labor union leader in South Africa that we met with was just outraged at what China had done to the textile industry in South Africa. And if we had met with other, and we ran into the same thing in Lagos and Abuja, not with with one labor union leader there also, outraged at the impact of Chinese textiles on the Nigerian and the South African textile industries. Although even that was not totally fair, because the Indians and the Indonesians and the Pakistanis and all the others have had almost as much negative impact as the Chinese have, but the Chinese are taking the brunt of the criticism for this. The point is that with these groups, not anywhere close to the enormous goodwill that you hear expressed by governmental leaders up and down the line. I mean, from prime ministers on down to mid-level bureaucrats. They're just all sort of licking their chops at what China has been doing for them. I remember talking with the director of roads in Ethiopia, and he was absolutely beside himself. China's building virtually all of the roads in Ethiopia today. It's on a commercial basis with Chinese loans. And he said, when we used to have the Germans or the Americans or someone else build these roads, first off, we'd go through these environmental assessments, and we'd go through long negotiations, and then the prices would be sky high anyway, and these people would be running around in their big vehicles and living in the fancy houses and wanting swimming pools and all this stuff. And then we'd get into these hassles on timing of getting the road done on time, and then it'd go to courts, and it was just a mess. Said, now we have a Chinese company come in and do it, and if I've got a problem, I just call the Chinese ambassador in Addis Ababa. I say, Mr. Ambassador, we got a problem with the Road and Construction Company of China. Would you go fix it? And he does. And we're back on track, and that's the end of it, and everyone's happy. That is, the director of roads is happy. I mean, that may be an extreme example, but maybe not. Maybe that's fairly common practice. It's a very different way of doing business, and the Africans at the leadership level like it. So you've got the civil society group on one hand. Opposition political parties were interesting because they didn't really fit in any category. You sort of felt that they were on the outs, but they wanted in. In other words, they didn't have, for the most part, they didn't have contact with the Chinese embassies, but boy, they sure wanted to have contact, and they were trying to figure out ways to get it. Some of them were more hostile. Some of them felt that the Chinese were too much in bed with, say, the government in Khartoum, and there was just no chance that China would ever be of any help to them, and therefore they weren't very happy with China. A couple of the smaller parties in southern Sudan felt that way. In Angola, it was a little different. I met with the chairman of UNITA, and he had actually met on a couple of occasions with the Chinese ambassador. Not much happened in the meeting. It was just a meeting. But you could just tell he was frothing at the mouth to have more contact with the Chinese ambassador and to have to sort of be on the good side of China in Angola. So with opposition parties, it's not clear-cut sort of where they're coming from. The last category that I'll mention briefly are the academics. As you would expect, there are academics who are very sort of pro-China, and there are academics who are very anti what China is doing on the continent, and that's the way academics are, so what do you say?
Chinese aid money, in fact, stays back inside China. And I remember hearing in the past, in the heyday of American aid to Africa, what percentage of American aid also likewise stayed back in the United States in expert salaries and procurement and things like that. And I wonder
Yeah.
what were the rough ballpark comparisons.
Well, the biggest distinction is not so much the one you're making, but the one I made earlier, in that the American aid is grant aid, so you're not paying a nickel for it. It's free money. It's wheelbarrows dumped out there and put on your front porch. The Chinese aid, almost all of it, the vast majority of it, are loans. So in theory, you've got to pay it back in oil or copper, or in the case of Ethiopia, goat skins and sesame seeds. I mean, it's a very, very different proposition. Your point, though, is well taken. I think the figure that we used to use for American aid is that about 80% of it used to end up back somehow in American pockets, either through the paying the experts who were out doing the projects, or by buying American equipment that was used in the projects. Now, what has happened to that percentage in recent years, I have no idea. My guess is it's lower than 80%, because there have been a lot of changes in the whole way that the U.S. does business. So I don't think it's anywhere near 80%, but it still is. It would be a noticeable percentage. But the big distinction is loans versus grants. And that's why I would be a little loath to even call much of what China does in the loan program to be an aid program. It's a business deal.
Do they pay the interest, the African countries, in cash?
No, virtually everything's paid on a barter basis.
Can I just make one?
I just want to add one quick point on this before we move
Sure,
on.
sure.
Sorry. It's actually more complex. Each deal is negotiated separately.
Right.
And in each deal, the major component, you're right, is primarily a business loan, or is a credit, or it is outright investment. In exchange is feedback for resources. But there's always a component of a grant, which is
Okay.
important.
Yeah.
So it's very much very similar to the Japanese one. So it's not purely commercial loan and payback by energy. So then there's a more component by the Chinese, which is difficult to calculate, is that they will send in, say, I'll build you schools, we'll send in building hospitals, and these are Chinese labor on their own low cost, and if you cost that into Western value, that will be cost very high. So it's very differently configured. Another component China is doing, which is challenging the Europeans and Americans, is to forgive the debts.
Right.
So China has
Right.
given billions of
Yep.
dollars
Yep.
already. They say you own this money, we no longer want you to pay back. So some of the loans years later being forgiven. So they're challenging the Europeans and Americans, and can you forgive yours? So that's why recently I find interesting that there was a bit of a change of mind on the IMF, US, European side. They're not forgiving foreign debts of Congo because of the $9 billion deal they signed with China. So I said, where is the connection here? I just want to add that point.
The debt cancellation point is a very important one, because a significant amount of earlier Chinese loans that had gone to Africa and built up a lot of debt have been canceled. That's absolutely true. As earlier Russian loans have been, debt has been canceled. Earlier American loans were canceled. This has happened pretty much across the board, but it's a very important point. On the grant thing, I was going back to the Angola example, and when I mentioned $13 billion, that is $13 billion of loans. Now, they do have, there are individual grants that China does occasionally offer, and they're oftentimes not even linked to these loans. They're just totally separate grants. But if you look at the dollar value of them, they tend to be quite nominal. $5 million, $10 million, $2.5 million, but there are a lot of them, and there is a grant program.
Can I just, I just wanted to make one comment. I just want to make a point. It's also about the loans. Because it's also an interesting then continuity, because some of you may know or not know that a large portion of the Tazara Railway was paid for by a commodity loan. And in this case, it was a reverse commodity loan, so China didn't have any foreign exchange. So all of these merchants would go to the Guangzhou Trade Fair and purchase all of this stuff and bring it into the cooperative, because we got the government cooperative shops, and then the proceeds would be put in a special bank and then used to pay for the construction of Tazara. And what's so interesting about that, I don't know if this applies, maybe we don't have time now to talk about it, but there were questions raised then, well, is this really non-conditionality? You know, if you have to accept this real flood of Chinese goods into these shops, and it didn't affect Tanzanian commodities very much, but it had a big effect on Kenya, which had been the source of many of these commodities before the railway was built. But just to say, this issue of commodity loans has another history.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's okay.
One last question.
I have a question for Mr. Shinn. I was wondering, are the grants really free money, or are there conditions attached to accepting these grants?
Now, as far as I can tell, the grants they're just that, they're grants. Now, it may be that you give a grant for $5 million to a country one day, and the next day the ambassador goes in and say, I need your vote in the Human Rights Council in the United Nations. But there's no direct link. No, there's no one-to-one link on it. It's if you don't support us in the Human Rights Council the next day, well, there's not going to be another $5 million grant, but that's, so be it. But technically there are no conditions attached to those.
I'm going to intervene here. I'm looking around the room, and many of you have been here since this morning. And those of you who are presenters, many of you came in very late last night. So I know it's been a long day, but an extraordinarily stimulating one. So first, will you please join me in thanking the members of our last panel. And just one more point before we respectively go off to our Friday evenings. I just want to call your attention to the program. We do have one more segment on Saturday morning, divided into two sections. Starts at 9 o'clock to 10:30, and that will be a roundtable discussion, trying to wrap up the themes, questions that have come up today. Very generously, Professor Zhang and Ambassador Shinn have agreed to be the moderators for that open discussion, so I invite any of you who want to come, please do. Then we're going to have a quick break tomorrow morning and finish up with open discussion about possibilities for the future, including publication or possible research collaboration. Again, you're more than welcome to come. So it's been a pleasure. I found this very stimulating and thanks all.